Hey y'all, it's Andrew with Free Tours by Foot in New Orleans. We've got Robi in the back playing Animal Crossing.
Yee.
And James next to the camera. And today we're gonna take you on an exploration of several of the plantations near New Orleans. We're gonna give you a basic impression of some of the ones that are most frequently visited by folks who are spending time in New Orleans. For us, this is part of a road trip. We're going to be going beyond all this to Baton Rouge pretty soon. But for people who aren't planning on doing a road trip, this is very much stuff that's within your reach from a stay in New Orleans. And it's pretty easy to find shuttles to the ones that we're going to be visiting. So we've chosen these for ease of access, for them being some of the most popular ones. The ones we're going to see today are Oak Alley Plantation, Laura Plantation, Whitney Plantation, and a little less visited, but an interesting contrast with those is St. Joseph Plantation. So we'll get to those four, mention a few others as we're getting done. You have a lot of possibilities if you're going to be driving yourself to these things. So many, many more besides just these few that we're going to hit today. And worth mentioning, all three of us in the car were plantation tour guides at one point. So all of us worked at the Myrtles Plantation in our hometown of St. Francisville, which we're gonna bring you up there further into this series. And James also worked at Rosedown Plantation. So we're gonna be dropping recommendations. We're gonna get a little bit into like what the flavor of these places is and what to expect if you decide to go to them, and maybe which one would be the best fit for you based on what you want. And I think all three of us can say, bearing in mind that recommendations are part of our aim, it really depends on what kind of guide you get, what a tour is like. Because, everybody brings different skills, and also everybody brings different perspectives. And it's one of the things that, so when we worked at the Myrtles, James and I didn't have any particular relationship with the place, but Robi, you had family that were enslaved there, and so you were very connected to the Myrtles. And how did you talk to people about, how did you bring that up with people who were visiting, and how do you think it affected the experience for them?
A lot of people are actually kind of in awe over the fact that I'm a descendant of these people, and that actually there as a tour guide talking about all this stuff. And I don't bring it up because they do history tours there, so y'all know. And we do talk about slavery there. I talked about slavery there whenever I worked there. And I don't bring it up. And then people would ask me, because I would talk about it so much, so are you from here? Are you one of the, and I'll tell them that. And then they'll just there's many mixed responses. One lady teared up and asked me what the hell I was still doing there. Mm-hmm. And I told her, spreading my family history and culture. Another person was really excited, we have the authentic experience. The responses are really different per person. The experience for me was just to be there, to represent in many facets what the plantation was, what it represented and whatnot, because you'll find a lot of plantations don't even talk about slavery. They want to concentrate on the furniture, and they want to talk about the things that make people comfortable, and I refuse to do that. So it was very meaningful for me just to work there and educate people. But Andrew was right. Yeah, we all worked at the Myrtles Plantation, but I grew up actually on the grounds of the Hollywood Plantation, where the other side of my family were enslaved. So that was a double thing for me, and my family's still out there on that land. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Well, we're going to be getting into those differences in focal point at these different spots in terms of what each one wants to tell you a story about. For y'all watching, we are crossing the Mississippi up here, so soon we're going to be over on the west side of the river, and it's just worth seeing this for one thing. The Mississippi is called Mighty for a reason, but also the river is where most of the plantations are, so conveniently they're all in a row. All of them needed riverfront land so that they could do their shipping. And so it's really easy to find them. And while we're taking the highway to get there, if you had some time to spare and you wanted to take the scenic route, scenic in a lot of ways, then doing what we did in our last episode, taking this bike ride along the river, you could drive along the river road and you can see a whole lot more, including plantations, all along the route. So if you want to get directly to these few that we're recommending and you're driving, then the highway's the way to do it. Otherwise, if you want to be surprised by plantations, then the River Road is a great way to see that, and plenty of other stuff too. All right, y'all, we just got into the area where this is all gonna happen. I wanted to say town at first. It's not actually one town. These plantations are all right around a town called Versailles, and the whole area is the German coast. We were on the German coast during our tail end of our bike ride, but this is an area heavily settled by Germans in the 1700s. See that in some of the family names around here. We're also on our way. We're gonna pass by our first plantation pretty soon. It was big enough and impressive enough in its day that it was nicknamed Little Versailles. So if you can picture French Versailles, this was a place that rivaled that somewhat. And house massive, of course, but also its original owner landscaped it with these insane gardens where he could produce the entirety of like a lavish local idea of a good meal from his own property. So he had imported like coffee trees and banana trees and all these other things that at the time you would not have found here. So beautiful space, but also practical, meant to produce everything that the house needed. And we are coming up on that spot. And there we are. There's Le Petit Versailles, gone without a trace. This is a former plantation of the wealthiest man in South Louisiana back then, this guy Valcourt Aimé. And supposedly way back there, there's some ruins somewhere, but it is pretty much gone, and mostly because in the years following the Civil War, it ended up being the guy went reclusive and it got abandoned eventually, and the house burned down in the 1920s, and that's the fate that's befallen a lot of these. So sorry if I hyped up your hopes and then disappointed you, but when you look at these things, it's worth bearing in mind, like a plantation, when we hear plantation today, people tend to think of a house, but a plantation originally was this massive factory farm. There was so much more to it than what we can see now. Maybe 5% of the property has usually been preserved, and the house itself used to be surrounded by what would have looked like a town. There were all these other structures because hundreds of people, mostly enslaved, lived on these sites. So what you look at today is just such a far cry from what these places would once have been. The absence of a whole lot of them speaks to that, but it's easy to think when you get to the site that you're really just looking into the past when it's actually way more complicated than that. Anyway, we're about to pull up to our first plantation that actually exists anymore, and that's going to be Oak Alley Plantation. Y'all, we've made it to our first stop. We are at Oak Alley Plantation, and the view kind of says it all. Like, if you had to boil down the value proposition at this place to one word, I think it would be vibe. So there's the namesake Oak Alley, which there's a lot of oak alleys in Louisiana, and like we said in our last video, all up and down the Mississippi you can find incredible live oak trees, which is what these are. This is one of the better oak alleys in the state, and there's good reason for that. The house down there, that Greek Revival house at the end, is built in 1830, but the trees are about a century older than that. So they had a huge head start on A, the house, and B, on a lot of the other live oak trees in the state. So great on a curve, for sure. This is one of the things that gets really associated with these plantations. And Robi, in our last video, you told us a haunting story about what live oak trees sometimes meant to enslaved people.
Oh, yeah.
And off camera, you mentioned to us something else, how these trees are sometimes planted in a ring.
On plantations back in the 17 and 1800s, and you hear me say that a lot, 17 and 1800s. Yeah, that was a big period. A lot of people associate these oak trees with life. A lot of people associate these oak trees with prosperity. Most people of color like me who are descendant of these people from these plantations know some of the true raw history that's associated with life, but the lack thereof. If you see, when you go to some of these plantations, you'll see these oak trees are planted in a circle. And the reason why they're planted in a circle is because that was the demonstration area for the slave owner. Whenever he wanted to make a point, whenever he wanted to prove something to his slaves to put the fear of God in them, he would bring them all to the center of those circle of oak trees. And normally there was either a lynching or a mass beating or the killing of a child, which is very visceral. A lot of people don't like to hear that, but that's what happened. So whenever you see someone like me going on a plantation like that, even just a visit, and I see those circle of oak trees, one can't help but get emotional because of what they actually represent in that circle. I'm very wary of oak trees when I go to places, just so you guys know. But that's a little piece of tidbit information a lot of people don't know.
And for people who were just exploring the grounds here, I mean, actually that's what a lot of people do, whether they're going to recognize spots like that or not. People who come and visit here generally are coming with the kind of big picture of the space in mind, and like these places really get turned into like all-encompassing destinations. Oak Alley has a restaurant and it has a place where you can stay overnight. So the house tour, the exploration of the actual big house, which is, you know, the kind of romantic center of it for a lot of people who care about these places, it's almost an afterthought. And really, when you look at a lot of people's sort of 5-star reviews, be like, incredible grounds, lots to see, lots to explore, delicious food, house tour was eh. And that's really going to depend on what guide you get, but as Robi mentions, bringing in those tougher stories is often not as much of a priority at places like this, where the story is mainly going to be about the family. So if you were to visit here, you'd hear a lot about Jacques Roman and his family. Valcourt-Aimé, who built the Petit Versailles plantation, actually built this as well. So these people were all real tightly wrapped up with each other. These guys were in-laws. But you'd hear a lot about them, and then you'd hear about the kind of fall and rise of the plantation again. The Civil War ruined a lot of these families. Naturally, having to pay your workers didn't let you have quite the same lifestyle as you had before, so the houses were often sold and then often abandoned. And this one, a little earlier than some, gets restored in the 1920s, and the guides love to tell you about how, you know, roaming hooved animals were wandering around in the house and they'd broken up the splendid black and white marble floors. So it looks very different on the inside today than it used to. So if something like, you know, historical accuracy of a house is paramount for you, the interior of this is likely not going to be super satisfying. Also, because this is the most visited plantation in the area from people coming from New Orleans, you also are going to have a lot of other people there, and the experience of taking the tour can often have you very aware of the tour group in front of you and the tour group behind you, so things tend to move pretty fast. So basically, a place to come and explore, a place to fuel back up while you're still on the grounds, and a place to definitely get this view from the end. But for a real focus on the house tour, we're going to see some other places further along that can deliver that a little better. For that view, though, you might have seen it before. This house has figured into Interview with the Vampire, also a lot of other films and TV shows, True Detective as a more recent one, and a Beyonce music video. And if you watch your Beyonce music videos, you can see maybe more New Orleans locations than you see in the Free Tours by Foot videography.
Also, a call out to her for throwing in some of our religious cultural references, for those of you who know what I'm talking about.
Our second stop, y'all, is Laura Plantation. This is very close to Oak Alley, and it's probably the second most visited one. A lot of times you'll actually see Oak Alley and Laura being bundled together for an option to visit both with transport included. So if you're just going with what's available from your hotel or from a tour company provider, chances are these are the ones you're likeliest to see. If we were to boil down the value proposition at this plantation, it would be quality of the tour, but focused on the family that owned the house. And the namesake of the house, Laura Plantation, is Laura Locool, who was one of the family of owners who spanned about 4 generations. And she was one of the last generation, and she actually was the one who sold the house off into other hands and moved away. But after she did that, she wrote this memoir and these family stories down into a book, which is the basis for the stories that they tell here. And it gives you this portrait of, a family that involved the women very heavily in the management of the plantation, which is not totally out of the norm. Creole families did this some of the time, and in Louisiana, women had property rights before they did in most of the rest of the country. But B, also a family where the women who had this ability were also totally down to do the kind of toe-to-toe with the men of the family that you might see in, like, I don't know, a mafia television show or something like that. You get the impression they were down to do that dance, even if they had to do it backwards and in corsets. So
it's so funny because as you was talking about that, especially with the whole Creole thing, we're now in territory of what you call freshwater Creole. That's my people.
And people always think that, oh, Creole, they must be from New Orleans. That's what you call a saltwater Creole. The freshwater Creole people are the people, the further you get away from the Gulf, the fresher the water gets, and that's what you see right now. There's crawfish mounds everywhere out here. And then there's lots of fresh water. And in our culture, as you guys know, women are dominant. Mm-hmm. So when I hear you talk about women-owned property and stuff like that, it just solidifies everything. It just solidifies everything I've been talking about.
And we should emphasize here that in the case of plantation owners, not always, but in this case, you were looking at a European extracted family. So that term Creole can be racially ambiguous,
yes.
But there's common cultural bonds, differences, but commonalities between, regardless of what the racial makeup of a Creole family is.
Yes. Creole doesn't necessarily just mean a black person. Creole at that time meant that your parents either came from the old world and then they gave birth to the children here in the new world and made the children Creole. And then they gave birth to Creole children, and then it just kept on expanding, and we have people like this. I had to differentiate between that, because it doesn't mean that the person is completely black or the mix or whatever that we're used to hearing about with the Creole thing. But that's important to know.
Yeah, it's a confusing term potentially, mm-hmm. and they brand heavily as a Creole plantation. The house is also Creole style, so it's different from what you see when you go to a place like Oak Alley. Oak Alley is built in the 1830s. This house is built right at the beginning of the 1800s, and that's going to be a difference of style because of those two different moments. So a Creole style house was one that was built elevated with a very sparsely used first floor, where if this river overtopped at some point, your water just passed underneath. So it was a practical style. It's also stuff you would have seen in the West Indies. And so when enslaved people, or free men of color as the time would have called them, came here and did most of the building work, they were bringing styles they knew how to do, and that led to Creole houses all over the place. It also happened to be very practical from a temperature and floodwater perspective, just like what you would have needed in the West Indies. So if you visit here, you're going to get that rigorous research tour of the interior. Again, always matters what guide you get, but it is still going to be primarily about the family that lived here. Slavery is more of a subject matter here than what you'd find at many plantations, but it is, like what you'd see at Oak Alley, primarily focused around an outdoor exhibit in a separate building, which is going to be optional. So it's not included in the tour. Individual guides are largely left to how much of those stories that they include. They do get interesting with the exhibit here, which is that if you hit up that exhibit, you're not only going to see stories about the enslaved people who lived on the plantation, but about their descendants who share a last name with the family here. And Robi, you've told me a lot about last names of enslaved people, last names of former enslaved people, and where those come from.
What's very important about the last name situation is that I'm an example of that. My last name is Gilmore. However, look at me. Like, obviously I'm Haitian African, right? Well, I grew up in Bayou Sara on Sligo Road. My last name is Gilmore. If you look up those two names, you'll land yourself back in Ireland and Scotland. And yes, my ancestors took on the last name of the slave owner, all the way up to here I am with this Irish-Scottish last name. And that was so common back then, before and after slavery, for people of color who were enslaved and actually earned their freedom to take on the last name of the slave owner. It's just a thing that happened.
And in this case, not only that, you also had people who were blood related to the slave owner.
I.e. me. We found out in my family, I did the digging, and another cousin of mine back home did the digging, that one of the slave owners actually raped a house slave, gave birth to one of my ancestors, and here I am with that last name. I'm a descendant of a slave owner. So I'm a mix of French, Black, Native American, you name it, it's probably up in there. But there's a piece of history where I am actually a descendant of a slave owner. Someone else you may not have realized is actually a descendant of a slave owner who's very famous, and we mentioned her earlier, and it's public knowledge now, Beyonce. Same thing happened inside her family as well.
So when you see mixed race families here, that's often a part of it, is that slave owners often had this sexually predatory relationship with enslaved people, and for that enslaved person, usually women, the least bad option was to go along, and you end up with children being born, slavery passed down through the mother's side, so generally the child was enslaved, and you ended up with men owning their own children. So oftentimes a last name being the same reflected not even just coming from the land where you wanted to tell people this is where I came from, but also coming from the blood that occupied that land too.
Also,
and they get honest about that here.
Yes, they do. And keep in mind that most women who were raped by these slave owners, when they got pregnant, the slave owner did deny that was his child. That was a common thing. If he were to be found out that he slept with a, well, I was going to use the term they used back then, but it's not appropriate for this tour, but we'll just say a black woman, then the baby was called a bacon. That means that the baby was born a mulatto, but we don't know who the white father is. We just know that the house slave gave birth to a half white, half black child. And because of the one drop rule, more than likely that child was enslaved on the plantation that their father owned and was owned by their father.
And these guys, the way they tell the story, the children who were descended from the plantation owners had a last name that was similar, but not quite the same as the plantation owner. So they get into some fine detail on this, and their guides are usually quite good about including these things. Now, I have met people traveling in New Orleans who went to plantations, found the preoccupation with the owning families really shocking and surprising. A lot of times folks from outside the US, and I even had a guy once say to me that when he visited a plantation, the way the things were prioritized, he said he felt like he had gone to tour a concentration camp.
Oh, wow.
And they had spent the whole time talking about the furniture in the officers' quarters. And so for people who think that way, there is another place, our next stop, which is primarily about, it is a museum of slavery, and it takes a proportional, population-based approach. Most people on the plantation were enslaved, so that's what they talk about. The owners are an afterthought. So next, we're gonna hit up Whitney Plantation, and we will see where that is the heart of the matter.
So you're looking at a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, how important and significant oak trees are as far as enslaved people were concerned. You see, you can look in the distance, you will see a random oak tree scattered just here and there. More than likely, according to our culture, there probably is a slave owner under one of those oak trees. And they're not cut down because the families would have not cut them down anyway, because you know that's where their relatives are buried. But that ties into the story of throwing the acorn inside of the ground as the slave owner is being lowered down, or many acorns, and then the oak tree sprouting, and then it just so happens there it is, and the family's not going to do anything about it because that's where their loved ones are buried. So this is I'm smiling for the right reasons.
Y'all, as we're making our way to Whitney, a few thoughts. So for one thing, the places we're visiting are on a couple of different kind of heritage trails. One of them is the Louisiana African American Heritage Trail, and then the other one is the andouille trail. And andouille is a Cajun sausage used in a lot of different Cajun foods, including classic gumbo jambalaya type stuff. And it's one of the biggest indicators of the German connection here. I say that because, as we've mentioned, Oak Alley has a restaurant, but the other plantations don't. And so if you were making a trip here on your own, or if you were doing this as part of a road trip, food is probably going to be a thing you need. And fortunately, multiple restaurants that are on the andouille trail, which means they're going to be great, genuine Cajun restaurants, are located in and around Vacherie. So you can check out that if you need some good advice for places to hit up. Y'all also will notice we aren't going inside of these plantations. They're their own properties, they do their own tours, and we definitely want y'all to come and enjoy the ones that you're gonna get the most out of. So we're just giving you the basic impression from the outside, but more to see, and their websites often have a little bit of a view of the inside if you're curious to get an extra taste of the vibe there. Y'all, we've arrived at the Whitney Plantation. This one, okay, we've mentioned first and foremost that this is a museum of slavery, and the very fact that they use the word museum to characterize what they do shows a seriousness here that at other plantations is sometimes, there are other words that they use to show what they want to do, like a resort or something like that. So you see where the priorities are here in multiple respects. And when you go into the grounds, the big house is actually the very last thing you see. As you go in, you're mostly seeing monuments that they have created to add things to the story that aren't otherwise visible, and you're also seeing that whole village of other buildings that serve various purposes and which, while they served the needs of the owners, were primarily used by enslaved people. So it creates a really different sense of the place as the kind of bustling centers of commerce that these plantations were. And not only is this site exceptionally well preserved, and that's really the reason why we're able to show that many things, at the same time, the stories here are something that only by chance almost really fell into our grasp. So we mentioned at Laura that the stories told there are available because one woman decided to write a book of her memories of her own life and her stories that she'd received from her family. And she was able to do that because she was literate and because she had leisure time in her life because she had money, and because there was an audience of people eager to get their hands on the stories of someone who had plantation memories. None of those things would have been as true for a former enslaved person. So it took a long time before enslaved people's own stories of their lives ever found their way into writing. And when they did, it was only when we had almost lost the last surviving generation of enslaved people. So in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the US government does many projects that fall under the heading of the New Deal. So you end up with this organization called the Federal Writers Project, and it's one of many things designed to take people who are out of work and make them federal employees for a little bit and do something useful along the way. Federal Writers Project did a lot of different stuff, but one thing they did was a survey of folklore and a survey of personal stories among surviving people who had been enslaved before the Civil War. And at that point, they're in their 70s and 80s. Before the war, they were children. So when you explore these grounds today, one of the interpretive choices that they've made is not only do you have these monuments covered in quotations by those people, but you have statues of children everywhere, because it was those children's memories who ultimately ended up providing the stories that are told here. When you go around those monuments, you're seeing quotations directly from people who had personal memories of a life as an enslaved child. It's not the whole picture, but it's more picture than you can get just about anywhere else.
The statues of the children are very important. It's very visceral, and I always tell people, bring a tissue when you come here. I've never been here. This is my first time coming here, so even Andrew is enlightening me on a lot of the history that's part of my heritage that I didn't even know. That's really important, and that's what this place does. So definitely visit here, come see, and bring the tissues, because you probably will cry, unless you're one of those kind of people just focus on some furniture.
Y'all, the monuments are really moving, and they cover a few different things. So they've built a monument specifically describing the enslaved people who were on this plantation. They built another one to the many enslaved people who died in childhood in Louisiana, childhood being a big emphasis here. They've also made a monument to all of the little over 100,000 known and nameable enslaved people who worked in Louisiana at different times. So the historian who does most of that work here is a guy named Ibrahim Seck, and he was mentored by one of the great Louisiana slavery scholars, Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, and she created this database of over 100,000 enslaved people, which is now this incredible resource for genealogy for people whose families come from here. And so there's a monument dedicated to all of those people and also to her, who's no longer with us. And there's one dedicated to that 1811 slave uprising that we talked about in the Mississippi River bike ride that we did. So if you didn't catch that story, that's one that's relevant to this area as well. We're still in the German coast, and so go back and check that out if that's a story that's new to you. Anyway, the monuments really are the focal point here. The house is an afterthought, and when you go in the house after seeing all that stuff, you really do feel that that was where 1% or so of the population of a plantation like this lived, and you also get the sense that they weren't all that glamorous. It's a quiet, dark, shadowy little space with no electricity, so any sense of modern glamour about these houses usually takes a lot of updating to do, and this one, while very well preserved, has not been modernized. It helps you feel that there's not much to romanticize about these folks' lives. So, as a last stop, y'all, we've gone to the 3 that are most commonly visited, but there's another one in the area called St. Joseph. It's going to be a trip back over near Oak Alley again, but it is a nice contrast with these, and it'll bring in one other perspective that helps bring us toward the modern day. So we're going to do one more stop before we wrap things up. Our last house to visit, y'all, is St. Joseph Plantation, and not as many people find their way to this one, although you still can find shuttles here from New Orleans that'll pair it with other ones that we've seen. So this house ties us back to Valcourt Aimé, that super wealthy guy whose plantation no longer exists. This was a wedding present from him to one of his daughters. It's named St. Joseph Plantation after her. Her name was Josephine. And it eventually passes out of that family into the hands of a family named the Wagaspaks, who also owned Whitney for a good bit of its history. So again, all these families tie together. And that family actually still owns the place. And that's what this one does that most of these other houses don't, is it ties things into the present. Because this was inhabited into the 1970s. So when you explore the house nowadays, you're seeing a place that is extremely updated. And you get a mixture of real vintage history that stayed in the family, very original in one respect, but then a lot of recently added amenities and so on in another respect. And it's still a functioning sugar plantation today. So the work element, which is gone from so many of these places, is still with us here. And you have on this ground, and actually on the grounds of a number of plantations, structures that were originally slave cabins that remained in use as residences for people working on the plantation into the 1960s or 70s or 80s. So it's really easy when you visit some plantations to get the sense that time just stopped for them after the Civil War. But there is an ongoing life for many of these places, and the sugar industry, which all of these that we've seen were sugar plantations at some point or another, is still a giant part of South Louisiana's economic life. So in that way, we can see the plantation world did not end after the Civil War, and this place gives you a great in on where it went after that. Even when you go here today, the guides, more often than not, are members of the family, so they have some really, really personal insight into the stuff. And places you might have seen this before. This is another one that's featured on film and TV. 12 Years a Slave used this as a location, and currently, as we speak, in spring of 2021, it's a shooting location for Oprah Winfrey Network's show Queen Sugar, which is about a family, 3 black siblings, inheriting a sugar plantation from their parents, and gets into the idea of black plantation ownership in the modern day in a small town in Louisiana. So lots and lots and lots of elaboration on some of the things that especially Robi's been talking about right here.
Speaking of Robi talking about some stuff, y'all, we don't get married on plantations. Y'all know that, right? I have to tell y'all that that is not a thing that we do. We don't go on plantations and have celebrations. We don't celebrate. That is just a tourist thing, y'all. Please, I'm begging y'all, stop doing that. Please stop doing that. It's kind of offensive. Like, don't plan your wedding on a plantation. Don't go there and be like, I've seen weddings where people will literally dress up in antebellum dresses, and the dudes will wear the Confederate, the little tight tie they used to wear and everything, and they would literally have a wedding just like that on these plantations. Now, mind you, I'm not saying this one does it or any of these.
They do.
Oh, never mind then. Yeah, I've said my piece on that.
So, events are held on these plantations all the time, y'all, and plenty of them that you cannot actually go into and tour are primarily event venues. So that's one more piece of this story, that when we focus on the ones that give tours, you don't get as much of a view of. There are also others that we have not hit up that, for many reasons, they're harder to get to from New Orleans, any number of reasons why they are not as high a priority for us. But if you're going to be doing a road trip yourself and you want to know the full spectrum of what's available, you've got Houma's House Plantation, which is another big, expansive grounds with lots of different features and a pretty well-preserved house from lots of different eras. You have the Nottoway Plantation, which is the one that calls itself a resort and has, tennis courts and things like that. You have Evergreen Plantation, which is another very well-preserved historical site around here. And then right across the river, you have San Francisco Plantation, which is visually a real marvel to look at. Very unusual, very distinctive. It looks kind of like a mini-colored steamboat and was the inspiration for a novel by Francis Parkinson Keyes, one of our formerly very well-known local novelists. So there are tons more to see. And if you're looking to take a collect them all approach, then plenty more that would be within reach of a road trip here. For us, we're headed up to Baton Rouge next thing. We'll pass by some more along the way, but we're going to give y'all a break from plantations in the next installment of this series. We're going to focus on the undiscovered treasures of Baton Rouge, a city that is often gone through rather than gone to. And so we're going to show you some things that are worth your time, whether through or to is going to be your way of coming at it. So we've all lived in Baton Rouge at some point,
Yeah.
so we're saying this with affection. So with that in mind, y'all, we're going to get back on the road and do next chapter. If y'all want to get more information about when those come out, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Give us a like, no matter how you feel about this. And leave us comments. Let us know what else you'd like to see. And if y'all would like to tip your guides, you'll find the information to do so in a way that will be shared among the party present down below. Thank you so much for that so far, guys.
We love y'all so much.
You really make this possible.
Y'all really are really pushing us to do these videos, and I have to tell y'all, because y'all know I'm a clown. I ain't clowned yet. You're going to see me clown, but I ain't clowned yet. I just want to give y'all a personal thank you so much, because it takes a lot of hard work and effort and time for us to do this. And if it's not for y'all, we wouldn't be doing this in the first place. So thank you.
It's an
y'all
honor.
so much.
Yeah,
it's an honor. It's such an honor and a privilege.
So happy to know y'all are out there, and we can't wait for you to come and check these things out in person. Meantime, we'll see you digitally again soon.
Bye.